This is Only the Strong Survive, a podcast powered by Kahn Media, where we dive deep into the world of business, leadership, and innovation. I'm your host, Dan Kahn, and I'm honored to have you join us today. So, let's get ready to learn some survival skills together. Hey everybody, it's Dan Kahn with Only the Strong Survive podcast, powered by Kahn Media and Tread Agency. Before we get into the latest episode, I want to talk to you for a minute about my new book, The New Rules of the Road, How to Navigate the Rapidly Changing Marketing Landscape. The book came out in early 2025, and it is already a #1 bestseller in 7 different categories, including the #1 book about communications and the #1 book about public relations and marketing on Amazon. And it's now available also on barnesandnoble.com. So if you haven't picked it up yet, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. Just search for The New Rules of the Road by Dan Kahn. Thank you so much for the support. It would not be a #1 bestseller without you and for your support on the show, of the book, and everything we do. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Only the Strong Survive, powered by Kahn Media and Tread Agency. Today, we have a really fantastic guest with us, Mario Iannantuono. Mario is an expert in operational systems, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting him through a client, through Blueprint Engines, and we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And he has his own business called Quantum Leap Partners, and I'm excited to talk about this. This will be one of our more technical episodes. We're going to talk about business operations, and it's something that's so critical and often overlooked until people are in sort of crisis mode, and then they need to fix things. So, Mario, welcome to the show.
Well, Dan, thanks for having me.
Just to kind of get started, Mario, you and I met, we've met a couple of times out in Nebraska. And I think in the past, there's maybe a hi, how are you? And then Norris Marshall, who was just on this show not too long ago, invited me out to sort of a business leadership summit, I guess you could call it. I mean, Norris is a really smart guy. And so I went in expecting to eat a couple of really good meals. And I thought, maybe learn a couple of things. I was not prepared to go into a conference room with you and sort of have my mind blown. Just to kind of, before we get into your history and your background and everything, just give everybody a quick recap of what you presented to our group that day. Because it was really an incredible eye-opening experience for me.
Yeah, so maybe I can kind of go walk you through how Norris and I got to doing work together. And we'll get a little bit into this, but I've known Norris from the past, and I'll say in 2023, Norris reached out to me and asked me if I could do some mentorship with some of his leadership team, primarily in the operations kind of realm. So we were doing some mentorship of some of his key people, and Norris likes to do mentorships with his folks. And as the year now, we've got more and more involved in operations excellence and started having a discussion that Norris has got a vision that he wants Blueprint to be multi-generation. So he asked me if I could help him get his organization up to the next level. I agreed to basically come on board and be his COO for a 1-year period with the mandate to kind of get him to a higher operating level that he can kind of operate at multi-generation and really make his organization going from good to great. So that was kind of the background. What we presented is the mandate here at Blueprint was like really threefold. One was put in a operating system that Blueprint needed to operate at a higher level. All right. And there was a definite need for that because they're getting more customers, and the customers that they're getting are becoming more, I'll say, higher expectations of performance. So one was operating systems. 2 was continue to develop the operating team here, or the leadership team here. And then number 3 was identify who could take over for me as I left. So now we're at the tail end of that. And I think what you saw when you came to Nebraska was the system that we put in here in that Blueprint. And the guys here are kind of just, absorbing that and just running with it. They're doing a fantastic job.
Very cool. And we will definitely get into what that operational excellence program looks like, because to give our listeners a sneak preview, I read a lot of business books. And for a long time, I was really kind of obsessed with Gino Wickman and the EOS system and his book Traction. And Alan Mulally from Ford and Boeing talks a lot about his business plan review. And then there's the whole Six Sigma thing. And it seems like what you've created is sort of a framework that takes the best of all those things and kind of integrates them. Before we get into all of it, I want to know, where did this all come from? How'd you get your start? You've got you've worked some pretty amazing companies. So what's your story?
So my story we'll start off is that I'm born and raised in Canada. Right. So I'm first generation in Canada. My parents migrated into Canada from Italy, got, educated in Canada, graduated with an engineering degree. And then when I graduated, I had the privilege that I got a job as a process engineer with an automotive OEM. Got to see how cars were built. From that point on, I always had kind of an excitement, a passion for continuous improvement. So worked in automotive, the OEM for a number of years, and it switched over to, I'll say, the tier 1 automotive market. aftermarket, worked for some very well-known companies like TRW and GCAN Automotive, to name a few. Did stuff like as a process engineer, engineering manager, eventually became a plant manager, ran a region, went to China for 2 years, and I built 4 manufacturing plants in about 3 or 4 years. Came back and ran global operations. In a period of time, I decided that I had enough of the automotive industry and I got out, and I went to go work for a company called Danaher. So when I was in the automotive industry, the benchmark was Toyota. Had a lot of exposure to Toyota, became a Toyota sensei, those types of things. And then when I left the automotive industry and went to go work at Danaher, they claim that their systems are better than Toyota's, right? And the way that they just reference that is their stock market pricing. Everybody in that organization is very well tuned on, I'll say, kind of driving continuous improvement in all parts of the business, not just manufacturing. So I got that experience. When I left there, I went to go work for private equity a couple times. Private equity, I was kind of the fix-it guy, is that every time that they would buy a new organization, I was the guy that would go in there and help them develop their strategy and then execute. That's kind of my background. The consulting stuff, I fell into it about 2 or 3 years ago, but we can talk about that in a little bit. I've had the privilege of working for a lot of world-class companies, and I understand kind of in the business world what works and what doesn't. And truthfully, I think the trick is not everything fits in every company, but you got to find the mix of what works in certain companies.
So I've had the pleasure of visiting a lot of manufacturing plants in my career. That's, to be honest, kind of one of my favorite things to do. Always has been. There's a huge chasm between an OEM building cars and even like a tier one, like a TRW, and then like the performance aftermarket, right? Like its size, scope, scale, supply chain. As you've kind of navigated this, is there commonalities from a little 50 or 100 person aftermarket company trying to make some sort of performance product to a company like a Blueprint or an Edelbrock to a company like a TRW and then to a GM or a Toyota? Do the same principles apply when you're trying to help them increase operational efficiency, or is it sort of a different ballgame every time?
I think you have to size up every kind of company, right? And obviously the big boys like the Toyotas of the world and the Danahers of the world, they've got an army of people that specialize in that stuff. I think the smaller you get and going down to the specialty aftermarket, they're relatively small to mid-sized companies, and they really don't have those resources to put those things in place, right? And I think that's where I come in. And at the end of the day, is that the principles are still the same, but you need to really focus in on what matters, right? And I think what you saw at Blueprint was really on the shop floor is that what matters is getting stuff out the door, setting up those systems to kind of do that. And I'm a big believer is that, if you read something, most people will forget it, but if you see a picture, it kind of sticks in your mind, right? It's all about visual management and understanding what that says and working together to kind of get down that path.
Walk us through the presentation. I mean, you don't have to go, obviously we don't have the deck in front of us here, but give us the kind of gist of what you were talking about when we were out in Nebraska, because it was pretty eye-opening what you've sort of created there.
When Norris and I at Blueprint decided that we're going to go down this path, is that gave him a bit of an overview, and Norris wanted to kind of see it and feel it first before he jumped into it and totally understood. But the way that we start this is that it started off at the top, and it started off with Norris originally, and asked him what true north is for Blueprint and got him to basically kind of articulate what true north looked like. True north being a couple of objectives, and it was primarily within a 1 year time frame. To say within the next 1 year, what do you want Blueprint to achieve? And we just went over probably about maybe 5 different top level objectives that you can imagine. Hey, I want my growth to be higher. I want my profit to be higher. I want X, Y, Z. So there's a number of things that we identified, and then we quantified that to say, okay, what do you mean by you want more sales? Okay, yeah, so we quantified, year over year. So once we had that, we took the opportunity to kind of just cascade that down to each of his leadership team. In the world that I came from, they call that policy deployment. We kind of grabbed that, and one by one with each of his staff members, we said, okay, if this is what the top level objectives are going to be, what are you going to do to contribute to achieving those top level objectives? So we did that with priorities. Once we did that, then we try to go back and say, okay, now how do we measure success? What do we know what winning looks like? Right. And that comes in the form of KPIs. Right. And we did the same thing with KPIs. Once we did that, we cascaded that down to the shop floor, which was aligned. Right. And the shop floor was really about, let's talk about safety, quality, delivery, inventory, and productivity. But what happened in the last 48 hours? What's going to happen in the next 48 hours? And what can we do as a leadership team to support you on being successful? And that's the way we kind of cascaded it. And the result was, after coaching and training with the people, you kind of saw what we delivered at Blueprint.
And can you give us, you don't need to give away Norris's internal numbers, but it was a successful mission, right? Is that?
Absolutely, right? So there's a number of things that we kind of measure, right? But safety, just a couple of things that, we had a number of safety accidents. And then within 1 year, they got their safety record down to almost zero for the entire year of last year. That's fantastic. Quality, we had an enormous amount of improvement on quality, kind of like quite big numbers. Inventory, this was kind of a big one for here. We had a metric here that was called pull-offs, and pull-offs is basically that you start something and then you have to stop it because we didn't have the raw material in-house to get it done. We went from a number of, call it anywhere from 15 to 20% of everything that we made got pulled off because we didn't have the material in-house. It was a supply chain issue. We've gone down to like single digits now. Right. From a growth perspective, we had a lot of, I'll say, backlog that we had to chip away at, got rid of all of that. And the profitability has gone up, I'll say, probably at least by 10 to 15% at a minimum. What we really did was we focused in on what mattered. When we looked at our KPIs, we had green and red. The message that I give everybody, red is not bad. Red tells us where to go work. That's all that red does. We went through a process that's focused in on the red. Let's eliminate the issues. As we started getting some wins, the team got very excited and it just cascades from there.
All right. So that all makes total sense to me. You're defining the win and then you're building sort of a business plan around how to achieve that win. I have a very different job than you do, but I also consult and work with a lot of different companies, and a lot of different types of leaders and a lot of different types of organizations. So I end up seeing a lot and has given me the opportunity to observe a lot. And one of the things I have questions about is how much transparency is not enough, how much transparency is too much. Because I understand that when you're coaching a leadership team, especially a senior leadership team, they need to all be aware of sort of what these wins are and kind of have the roadmap. How transparent are you with the guy on the floor in the factory or the lady who's doing pre-assembly as a part-time job? I mean, these people, they're critical to achieving those wins, but also like there's a lot of opportunity to potentially, I think people in leadership can be afraid sometimes of like, well, how much is too much? Am I going to scare them if they know we're having a problem? Or how do you navigate that?
The way that we do it, the way that I do it is that I think the further you go down into the organization, you need to really speak their language. The obvious way of looking at that is that you're not going to share all of the financials with the folks that are on the shop floor because that's not the world that they live in. Typically, if you go over a lot of financial information, they really get lost because that's not the world that they live in. On the shop floor, the world that they live in is pieces and production. So you should try to translate what we do here is that what I've always done is that you take that financial data and translate it into languages that the people on the shop floor understand, like pieces. What's the goal for pieces? What's the expected number of reject that is okay and what's not okay? Put it into their format to make sure that they understand it because you do have a tendency of losing people if you get too complicated, right? And really try to keep it simple, the things that they understand.
That makes sense. And I guess speaking from my own experience working for other people before I worked for myself, I'm an innately curious person. And I always want to know how I'll walk into other departments that have nothing to do with me and just ask how they do their job. But I think a lot of people aren't like that, right? They want to kind of stay in their walled garden. How do you connect those dots? Is that through a leadership team? So if you've got a supply chain team, because one of the things you mentioned that I thought was sort of interesting is if they've got back orders because they're having problems on the supply chain side or raw material side, on the shop floor, maybe there's interruptions in production for whatever reason, somebody gets hurt or a machine goes down. These are all very disparate things. First of all, how do you connect all those dots so that everyone's on the same page? But also, how do you personally, Mario, having kind of parachuted into this company, how do you even figure all this stuff out?
One of the things that we do that I really encourage people to do is that in their companies is what we call a Gemba walk. Okay. And a Gemba walk is a Japanese term. It means go look see. We've established, I'll say, a very visual system that connects the dots through the entire facility and drives what's important for the departments and also what's important for the company. Right. We all connect the dots and the leadership team walks around and we get a very quick update of what is going on in our manufacturing plant, what's important and where the critical items are. And that takes us half an hour to get that done. It's very transparent in doing that. Now, if they have a problem, it takes multiple departments to understand what the root cause is. We do have a process that I've introduced to the organization here, and it's a problem-solving activity. And when we have those problems, what is very typical in a lot of companies is that people do get emotional and they kind of start using opinions of what the problem is and what the issue is. And through this process that I've introduced here, that blueprint and other companies, is that we follow the data. The data tells us where the issue is, right? And we dig into very deeply on going into the data. And we use a process that's called the 5 whys, a problem solving technique that a lot of the Toyotas of the world kind of use. And it primarily says if you ask the question 5 times, you'll eventually get down to the root cause. Because the last thing that we want to do is kind of just put a band-aid on an issue and then move away and it's not being resolved. People understand the data, right? They understand the data, they understand what's going on, and ultimately we get down to the root cause and we fix it and we put it to bed, and that way it doesn't come back. Using their language and their data to really resolve multi-departmental inputs.
Interesting. So how do you implement that? Is there a carrot? Is there a stick? Is there both? I mean, when you're talking about especially like that kind of middle manager layer, in my experience, those people tend to sometimes not always be super open to change. And you're injecting a lot of change that requires openness and communication in this process. How do you do that and keep everybody engaged and happy?
What we do is that, and I'll give you kind of something that I kind of live to, and even my consulting company, what we use as a tagline is that Benjamin Franklin had a quotation, and it basically said, "Tell me and I'll forget, teach me, I'll remember, and involve me and I'll learn." We really try to roll up our sleeves and kind of get engaged, and not for me to come in and criticize what they've done in the past, but to say, okay, it is what it is. Let's learn and understand what this data is. And the organizations with the leadership team, okay, and myself, is that they see us truly getting engaged in trying to resolve what that issue is. I don't pass judgment of what happened in the past. It is what it is. And we take a look at the data and let the data speak for itself. And we try to knock out these issues. And I think once they see that it truly resolved the issue, they become believers in it. Right. And I think it's those small wins to really figure out what the solution is. And then people become owners of it. And then they want to kind of start implementing that into their departments, right? So here at Blueprint, we've done at least 5 or 6 of these 5 whys, and it's worked in every single situation. It's worked, and it's kind of resolved issues that we had either with a customer or an internal issue or multiple issues, right? So it's doing it by hands-on approach.
Can you give me it doesn't have to be a real one. It could be something you just make up, but can you give an example of how that 5 whys works, like what that actually looks like in practice?
Yeah. So we had a quality issue in one of our departments here. They were losing quite a bit of throughput because one of our departments, it was a leak test, and we were having an issue, and we are losing probably a good 10% of our throughput every single day. We kind of got the team together, a cross-functional team, and even if we have to get hourly employees involved in that because they're the ones who use that data and they're the ones on the front line. So the first level is what's the trend line of the leaks of that department, right? So we take a look at the last 12 months on what that trend line looks like. From there, we break it down into a specific department. Then from there, we try to break it down into big buckets of Paretos of what we think are the failures. And it'll give us like the top 5 different failures that we have. And then we'll take typically kind of the top 3 or something that represents probably about 20% of the issue, and try to find the data further down on what caused that issue and keep asking it down. So once we understand where that failure is, now let's go back and we get all the, I'll say, the experts within the company involved, and we start asking why that happened, right? And we keep asking, well, it happened because of this, right? And then say, okay, now why did that happen? And we keep asking that question 5 times, and ultimately we kind of get down to what we think is the root cause. Once we figure out we think that that's the root cause, we will actually put an experiment in place and say, okay, let's go try it. Let's put it in place, and we'll see if we can shut that off or recreate that condition. And by doing that, we'll identify that that's the root cause. And then we'll put a temporary action in place, because sometimes the permanent action might take a little bit of time. You might have to buy something from the outside or something. But we'll put a temporary fix in place, and then we follow that up with a permanent action. And almost every time that we've done that, it's resolved the issue that we've always had. And then we move on to the next issue.
So it's really not a carrot or a stick. It's more of an exploration of a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. When I've walked the tour now a couple times of that plant, I've seen kind of big whiteboards that are in different departments, and they have like kind of these like numeric spreadsheets that look like letters. What is all that? Can you explain what I'm looking at there?
Yeah. So that is what we call a SKU dip board. Okay. And SKU dip is it's the letters: safety, quality, delivery, inventory, and productivity. Each department has those boards. right? And inside the symbols, right? Because so safety have like a safety cross, and quality will have the letter Q, and then D, and then I and P, and within that are the days of the month. So what we try to do on that board is that we have what we call the 1-3-10-second rule. Okay, so anybody should be able to walk up to that board and and it's color coded every day. If you hit your target, it's green. If you miss your target, it's red, right? And safety is an easy one to kind of talk about. So if you had no accidents, it's green. If you had an accident, it's red. Below that is a trend chart that shows how the performance has been within that month and also in the prior months. And then below that is an action plan to fix that. So the way it works is that within 1 second, anybody can walk up there, not knowing anything about the business, and taking a look at where all the red is. It identifies where the issues of that department are. Below that is the trend line to see if the trend is getting better or worse. And then below that, what's more important is the action plan on what that team is doing to convert those reds to green. So that's the process, and that's the gimbal walks, the visual management that we have on the shop floor.
How often do you change those out?
At the very beginning, it's all about the metric. What's the standard? Okay, what does green look like and what does red look like? What I've taught the folks here is that if you go up to a board and it's all green, then those standards, those goals are way too loose. So you have to kind of change it out. If you see something that's totally red all the time, the target's too tight. All right, you're gonna discourage that team. So it's a bit of a balance. And what we'll do is that, we'll run, and if we have a continuous improvement that kind of gets us to a green state and we can sustain that green state, what we'll do is that we'll tighten up the goal, right? And there's always that drive of continuous improvement to get better, get better, get better all the time.
So it might start monthly and then it becomes biweekly and then it becomes weekly and then it becomes daily or something like that.
Yeah, the walk is every day, right? So the
Okay.
walk is every single day. We kind of take a look at where we are every single day. But if the trends are trending into a positive situation and it's green, we'll take an opportunity to task the team for some continuous improvement.
Switching gears for a second, tell us a little bit about your consulting business. When did that start? Who's involved? What kind of companies do you work with?
Kind of fell into it, right? So about 3 years ago, truthfully, I decided that I was going to retire. I did so. And shortly after I decided that I was going to retire, I had a lot of colleagues of mine that called and said, "Hey, is it true that you're retired?" And I got asked if I wanted to do some short-term consulting with various people, right? Did the typical stuff, went traveling a little bit, went played golf, and then truthfully found myself kind of totally bored and had to do something different. So I actually got into an association called SCORE. Not sure if you ever heard of them before, but it's an association that basically helps young entrepreneurs develop new companies and things like that. It's a free service. It's part of the Small Business Association, right? And it's across the entire country. So I became a mentor for SCORE. Started doing some small projects for colleagues of mine, and I had a couple of other friends that I used to work with. They're all kind of around the same situation as I was. So we decided that we were going to form a company called Quantum Leap Partners. The Quantum Leap Partners, we got 3 partners altogether. There's myself, I got a partner in Brazil, and I got a partner in Europe. And we primarily focus in on small to mid-sized companies. We try to stay away from the big companies because, like I said before, is that the big companies, they have a lot of people like us that can go in there and fix these things. And we really think that the small companies and mid-sized companies, they're the ones who are really starving for this kind of work and this kind of expertise and leadership because they're smaller, they don't have the resources. And what we do is that we go in there and we can show them the way on what they have to do to really become competitive because they're the ones that are really on that verge that if something happens, that they can go out of business, right? So we focus in on things anywhere from helping them align on their strategies, helping them fix productivity issues that they may have inside their facilities, or we can also help them with interim assignments, regardless of what kind of the position is. But we primarily focus in the automotive industry, automotive aftermarket industries.
What's your take, having come from both big multinational OEMs to outside the industry, coming back into the automotive and even aftermarket? On the marketing side, I've always said that the aftermarket is about 5 to 10 years behind a lot of the other industries that we work with on marketing. And, we're doing our damn best to get them up to at least current, if not ahead of the curve, but it's sometimes it can feel like an uphill battle. Do you see that on the operational side as well or no?
Absolutely. Right. So, again, is that the companies that we deal with, it's nothing that they did not do, right? But, they don't know what they don't know, right? And typically a lot of them are small organizations. They may have one or two facilities. Even if they're owned by an owner, that person has grown them and they've done what they had to do to kind of survive in the organization, right? And they brought in tools that they may have heard, and unlike the big automotive companies, they got the cutting edge technology. The small companies, they just don't have that, right? And that's why when you go into a small organization like what's in the automotive aftermarket, you got to really be careful on picking what is going to work for them. They're not going to be able to support all of the initiatives that a big organization has. So you got to be very selective of what systems you put in place and what is going to bring the biggest bang for the buck and what can they absorb. They can't absorb everything at the same time. So it is really a journey to get them on the right path.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. And I guess from my perspective, and we have two agencies, one in automotive and one in outdoor rec. And one thing that those industries have in common is many of the brands outside of like either the super groups that are mostly private equity owned or the giant publicly traded ones, which aren't that many, the majority of the brands in both industries were originally founder led by somebody who usually was a product person. Usually they were like an engineer or just a garage tinkerer who had an idea for a better thing, whatever it is, whether it's a tent or a cylinder head or whatever it is. They woke up one day and said, I have an idea of how to solve this problem and I'm going to go make it. And then they build a business around it and then they scale the business. And from what I've seen, there are rare examples where they can just sky's the limit. Most of the time they scale it to a point and then sort of hit a wall. Is that what you've seen as well? And then like they need help after that point. And like, what is the wall? Like what happens there?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Okay, is that and again, most of the systems that are put in place, I'll say, are homegrown systems that they've been able to do, and I think they tend to outgrow those systems. And I think that most of the homegrown companies, they know once they start getting some scale, can their organization really absorb all this stuff with the homegrown systems that they have? We've been talking a little bit about Blueprint. And that's the kind of awareness that Norris came to say, hey, my company's growing and I cannot use the same systems as I did 10 to 15 years ago, right? And him and I have had these discussions before is that I cannot compete with Norris when it comes to developing engines. That's not my wheelhouse. So we complement with each other. I'm not your design guy to design an engine, but I can put a system in your company to scale you and make you world class. There's comes a point, I think, that you have to go to the outside to companies like mine that can show you how to kind of get there.
On the flip side, I guess the inverse of the question is, so when I first met my wife, she was a supply chain analyst, first in the energy industry for a couple of oil and energy companies. And then she worked in the aerospace industry doing the same job, actually as a subcontractor to the space program. And when she was at the oil companies, the supply chain process was clunky but effective. When she went into aerospace, the stuff I was seeing it like blew my mind, like huge budgets, 9-figure budgets. But the rules they were operating within had become so bloated, I think because of government sort of regulation, that like I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And this is 20 years ago, because I come from like the automotive side of things. So whenever she talks about something I actually could understand, that made me happy because most of the time it was over my head. And she was working on a project for a main engine for a rocket. They needed cooling lines and they were these braided stainless coolant lines. And to my eye, they looked pretty damn similar to the stuff we use in our industry, like all the time, right? And she's like, well, yeah, I have to have like a minimum of 3 different bidders, but really they want 5 bidders. And we've got this one company that's always supplied us and does a good job. And we've got this other one that's going to come in. The amount of money they were going to spend on this was astronomical. Like it was crazy how much money they were spending on this stuff that we could get in our industry, probably the same product, to be honest, for like a 20th of the price. And I think because it had some stamp on it, they ended up saying, well, hey, we have this one supplier that's really good and is always reliable and they've never had a failure. But these other guys are 5% cheaper. So we're going to go with those guys. And she had no say. This is our process. You have to stick to the process. We're going to go with the lowest bidder. And to me, as a small business guy, that blew my mind. I'm like, wait, we're talking about 5%? Like for 5% and you have this astronomical budget, why wouldn't you go with the vendor that you know is going to deliver on time, has a quality product? By the way, these are coolant lines for a rocket engine. If they fail, not being a rocket scientist, my guess is this is bad. This doesn't even seem like a issue to me. On the big business side, when you're working with big companies, like what do you like? Is that something you ran into, and how do you deal with sort of the inverse problem where they're so big that they're kind of paralyzed?
In my career, I had the privilege of going to work for General Electric, and I worked in the nuclear division. That is so out of character of the automotive industry. The regulations that they had there, sometimes it was not unrealistic for us to prove out a process that would take 4 years to prove out. The amount of regulation was unbelievable. But again, it's the way you look at it, and they did a great job on implementing the operational excellence in the nuclear division. But you're right. I'll say that one of the reasons why I like working in the automotive aftermarket, truthfully, it's small enough, it's nimble enough that we can make those decisions, that it doesn't have to be only price and only something that is regulated by, I'll say, kind of the big company, right? And it's night and day. Personally, myself, I just enjoy working much, much more in the small companies that you've got more flexibility. You can make that decision on, is this best for my company? And you can take a look at the quality perspective. You can look at the delivery perspective, the cost perspective, and those all have a role to play in the supplier that you're going to choose.
When you're working with a company and you see there's a challenge, there's some sort of issue that needs to be resolved, and you've given a lot of examples of them today, and you start working through the process, do you ever, I mean, I have to assume human nature being what it is, that occasionally you run into one where it seems like sometimes bad team members, bad managers, they do sort of self-identify with time, right?
Yeah.
How do you manage those when you are trying to get things fixed and get all those numbers green? What do you do in those scenarios?
And human nature is human nature, right? Not everybody's going to say this is fantastic and jump on that train. So some people take a little bit more convincing than others, right? So I think what's important, especially in the small aftermarket, to me is that I've implemented this a lot in a lot of different companies. And I'll say is that you got to have the support from the people on top to drive this type of initiative, right? Because human nature is human nature. They will focus in on what the top guy of the company feels is important and what he communicates important. And if that person communicates that this stuff is important, kind of the bad apples, they'll just wean themselves out. But a majority of the folks will fall in line and give 150% to deliver on that. And we try to focus in on the 98% of the positives and kind of let the 2% fall by the wayside.
What's your philosophy on the 2%? Is it, hey, we're just going to sort of let them keep doing their thing, or do you want to remove them from the swimming pool as quickly as possible?
It depends. It depends on what kind of position they have, and if they're in a position that influences a lot of people. I think you got to take care of that situation, right? Had a boss tell me sometimes is take care of the issues that keep you up at nighttime, right? And if that person is going to prevent you from moving forward, then you got to take action, address that issue.
Makes sense. You're a manufacturing guy. That's clear. You spent a lot of time in your career working for companies that make stuff. Just in my lifetime, I've seen this really interesting arc. I think, you and I are probably roughly the same age. And we used to be a country that makes stuff here. I mean, I remember, obviously you're from Canada originally, and a lot of production on the OEM side went to Canada and Mexico and NAFTA, and that still seemed to be, at least on the continent, there was a lot of stuff. And I mean, I visited the NUMMI plant years ago before it was now a Tesla plant. And I remember like they were making some product there in the Bay Area, and they were building like Toyota Tacomas, and they had a rail spur, and there was pre-assembly happening in Mexico, and some stuff was happening here, and final assembly was there, and trucks go around the country. And I remember when the Japanese started manufacturing more in this country, and like Honda opened their Marysville plant and things like that. It seemed like more recently, a lot of manufacturing, aftermarket, OEM, even things like furniture and stuff like that, almost entirely went other places. And it seems like maybe things are coming back. And obviously there's a lot of chatter with the election and tariffs. And I know a person who was in a garbage enclosure business, and she was almost exclusively sourcing her product from China. And just the looming threat of increased tariffs, she's now investigating nearshoring or onshoring her production, and I think ended up choosing a shop in Canada because she couldn't find one in the US that was willing to do it with the margins she needed. So being a lifelong manufacturing guy, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where is this all going, and what kind of trends do you see happening? Is this good? And where's it going?
I think with, especially with the pandemic, I think that opened up the eyes of a lot of people, right? The supply chain issues that we had around the pandemic, and I think a lot of companies have kind of stepped back and really realized to say, you know what, maybe localizing our production might be a better situation. And I think similar to you is that I've seen more and more companies actually giving us calls to say, hey, can you help us out with localization back into North America? Okay, North America that hemisphere anyway, to make sure that we can get our product in a much quicker time, right? So I am seeing the trends of people starting to come back. It might be industry specific. The manufacturing based stuff, I think, is starting to look like they want to come back. And I think that's a good thing. The more that we can bring back to North America, you got better control of it, right? So just the difficulties of dealing with suppliers that are kind of on the other side of the world, and the language and everything else, it makes it very difficult. But I think a lot of companies are taking a look at the big picture and what the total cost is, looking at more favorability to bring stuff back.
That makes sense. On a similar note, you and I both, I think, do a fair amount of work or have done a fair amount of work with private equity. My arc was I helped a lot of these founders build their companies so they could sell them to private equity. And these days, we're getting a lot of calls from the companies now that they've been flipped a couple times. And these days, the calls are coming from the private equity bankers, not even from the people in the companies saying, hey, okay, this thing's been rolled up and sold a couple of times and we need to sort of fix it. Can you help us? I love doing stuff like that. I like fixing things, but it has been an interesting arc. Obviously, we're on the marketing side. You're on the operations and manufacturing side. Are you seeing that too? And kind of where do you see this all going with PE over the next, money's gotten a lot more expensive, industries change. Where do you see all this going over the next couple of years?
That's an interesting question, right? So I think the PE activities was probably more prevalent in the bigger companies, but I think you're seeing more and more of it kind of come into the automotive aftermarket, right? I'm not sure it's going to take off as much as people think it is, because I think there's a lot of pride in a lot of organizations that they don't want to go to private equity because there's a fear. There's a fear of losing the brand equity that they have inside their company going to private equity, right? So I think that it's not going to be as big as it was in the past.
So you think that it's actually probably going to start slowing down a little bit?
I think so. I think that there's a lot of pride in companies want to keep it whole and not just sell it for the profitability of it.
Makes sense. I hope so. That'd be good.
Hope so too. Right.
Question I have for you that I think about my own arc and starting my own business, and I was so ignorant that I didn't even know what questions to ask. I didn't know who to ask. A lot of foundational mistakes that I then had to clean up a decade plus later were things just like how I formed my business, how much money we started the business with, like what the structure of the business looked like, what our like operational program looked like, what our like financial reporting and projections. Didn't have any. I just didn't know. I didn't even know what I didn't know. If somebody was listening to this and they're in the process of starting a company, or they're thinking about starting a company, what is the primer you would give them to say, hey, here's the punch list, the pre-flight checklist you need to know to at least educate yourself to the point that you don't sort of walk into a giant flaming trap here? Like, how do you prepare yourself so that you are in the best possible position for success?
Kind of starting a company is you're right. You don't know what you don't know. And I'll say that primarily is that what we did, we were lucky enough that we knew a number of individuals that we can do some benchmarking and share how they got into it and kind of where to go. One of the things that we decided from the very get-go was that we can't be the answer for everybody on every single project. There's no way. That's not our wheelhouse. It may sound sexy that you can kind of get all these projects, but you want them to be successful projects, right? So we have to take a look at what's the market that we want to be in and what's our core competencies. We've spent a lot of time doing that to kind of really focus in on small to mid-sized companies, right? Primarily within the automotive industry, because that's our sweet spot. That's what we know. We can add a lot of value. And that was the biggest thing that we had to come to grips with. What market are we really going to try to serve? That was the biggest thing that we had to wrap our arms around.
So you defined your market, small to mid-size automotive. And then did you set out with you and your two partners? Did you say, hey, did you have financial projections? Did you have goals? How'd you structure things that way?
Yeah, first we started going down the path of like, what are our offerings, right? Because, in the consulting world, there's a lot of people there kind of doing that either in a larger organization or you have a lot of independent people. We really had to kind of define what's the market and what are our offerings, what makes us different than everybody else. All right. So once we defined that, and actually, that took us quite a bit of time establishing how that was going to look like and what the standards within our own organization. Because the last thing that we wanted to do is that we had 3 different partners that we go somewhere and execute something 3 different ways. We had to standardize on what the offerings were going to be, what our approach was going to be. Once we got that, we did talk quite a bit about our structure. Okay, our financial structure, what that was going to look like, what our goals are, how we were going to get that done, right? And again, in the consulting world, is that the fees do play a part of it, because truthfully, people that bring us on board is that typically the last thing they want to do is they want to go to a consultant and pay them to fix their issues. So we had to make sure that we were competitive. So we really worked on our operating system and kind of our financial structure. And we did put together a very simple financial tracking on what our financials were going to look like and how we were going to structure that. One of the things that we did do is that we set up what we preach to our customers, okay, is having systems defining our long-term plan was going to look like. Long-term for us being, let's take a look at the next 2 to 3 years. What do we want to look like? And really using those systems that we implement at our customers, we use those internally to drive the performance and the growth of our company.
That makes sense. And when you're embedded in an organization like you are right now, are you still checking in with your partners? Are you guys still I assume they're probably doing something similar. Is there like an interplay between the three of you, or are you kind of all bunkered in and doing your thing?
During the day, I'll say from 8 o'clock until about 5 o'clock, we do our assignments that we have, either off hours at nighttime or on the weekends. We'll do a touch base, right? So we typically touch base with one another at least twice a week or so, make sure that we're progressing the business forward, right? And not all of our partners are busy 100% of the time. The ones that are actively working with clients, we know that I got to focus on executing that contract, and that puts the load a little bit more on some of the partners that perhaps are not actively busy to formulate and make sure that we're pushing the business forward. We still stay engaged. We have to stay engaged. That's the way that we do it.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, as we kind of round out our hour here, I wanted to ask you the same question I ask every guest. And the preamble is that I'm one of those unfortunate souls that only really learns things through messing stuff up and learning from my mistakes. I always ask our guests the same question. And so the question is, if you think back on your career, what is the biggest mistake you made along the way and what did you learn from it?
I say that the biggest mistake that I made and I learned from it was that, as you progress up into an organization, you take a leadership role. I think the tendency is that you feel that you've got to be an internal expert in every area that you kind of manage within a business. Bring it up to being a leader of an organization. For years, I felt that I had to be the expert in every part of my business. I had to be an expert in sales, engineering, financials, operations. What I learned over the years is that I don't have to be an expert in all those areas. My role is to be a leader, is to lead the organization. I really learned that, surround yourself with really good people that are subject matter experts in those areas. And my job was to lead, not to be the expert in every single one of those areas.
That makes sense. And then find people to back you on those things you need.
People that have the passion like you do to drive the business forward.
Very good. Mario, where can people learn more about you and your organizations and connect with you?
We do have a website, and our website is www.quantumleap.partners. And you can kind of access our website there and take a look, a deeper dive into the different offerings that we have and take a look at some of the other partners. Or they can contact me on my email, which is marioi@quantumleap.partners.
Very good. Mario, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today. For our listeners who want to learn more, please visit Mario's website. As he said, it's quantumleap.partners. And that wraps up this episode of Only the Strong Survive. If you enjoyed this conversation, please make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your network. A big thank you again to Mario for joining us. Until next time, take care.